The stars looked different through the bridge windows of the New Horizon as Captain Jake Morrison watched their destination grow larger on the screen. Kepler 442b hung in space like a blue and green jewel waiting for them to claim it. After 3 years of traveling through the dark between stars, they had finally reached their new home. "Captain, we're getting some strange readings," said Lisa Chen from her science station. Her fingers moved quickly over the controls as data flowed across her screen. "There are artificial structures on the planet's surface and several large objects in orbit." Jake felt his stomach drop. The planet was supposed to be empty. Earth's long-range scans had shown no signs of intelligent life when they launched the colony mission 5 years ago. He walked over to Lisa's station and looked at her. Readings. The objects were clearly made by someone with advanced technology. "All stop," Jake ordered. The ship's engines went quiet and they drifted in space. Around them, the other colony ships in their fleet also came to a halt. 15,000 human colonists were spread across 12 vessels, all counting on him to get them safely to their new world. Ryan Burke, their military commander, joined them at the science station. His face was grim as he studied the data. "Those orbital platforms look like weapons," he said quietly. "Big ones." Before Jake could respond, their communications officer called out from across the bridge. "Captain, we're being hailed. The signal is coming from one of those orbital platforms." "Put it on screen," Jake said. The main display flickered and then showed a face that made everyone on the bridge step backward. The being that appeared was tall and thin with pale gray skin and large black eyes. When it spoke, its voice was cold and mechanical. "Primitive creatures of Earth," the alien said, "you have entered space belonging to the Zephyrian Empire. This system is claimed territory. You will surrender your vessels immediately or face destruction." Jake stepped forward, trying to keep his voice steady. "I am Captain Morrison of the Human Colony Fleet. We were not aware this system was occupied. We're peaceful colonists looking for a new home. Perhaps we can find another world that meets both our needs." The alien's expression did not change. "There is no negotiation. You are weak beings with inferior technology. Your species exists only because we allow it. Submit now or die." The transmission ended, and the screen went dark. Jake looked around the bridge at his crew. Their faces showed the same mix of fear and anger he was feeling. After traveling so far and risking so much, they were being told to surrender by creatures they had never met. "Captain," Ryan said, "we have weapons. Maybe not as advanced as theirs, but we can fight." Before Jake could answer, alarms began blaring throughout the ship. Lisa's hands flew over her controls as she tried to understand what was happening. "They're targeting the Darwin," she said. The Darwin was their agricultural ship, carrying seeds and farming equipment for the colony. Jake grabbed the communication system. "This is Morrison to all ships. Evasive maneuvers now," but it was too late. Through the bridge windows, they watched in horror as bright energy beams struck the Darwin. The ship exploded in a flash of light that lit up the darkness of space. 3,000 colonists died in that instant, including families with children, who had dreamed of growing up on a new world. The alien voice came through their speakers again. "This demonstrates our power. You have 1 hour to surrender all vessels or we will destroy another ship. Choose wisely." Jake felt the weight of 14,000 lives pressing down on him. These people had trusted him to lead them to safety, and now they faced an enemy they could not hope to defeat. The Zephyrian ships moved closer, their weapons trained on the remaining human vessels. "What are your orders, Captain?" Ryan asked. Jake stared out at the wreckage of the Darwin floating in space. Pieces of metal and plastic drifted past their windows like snow. Somewhere in that debris were the bodies of people he had known and cared about. Children who would never see their new home. Parents who would never watch their kids grow up. "We can't fight them," he said finally. "Not with civilian ships full of families. But this isn't over. We'll surrender for now, But I promise you, this isn't the end of humanity in space. He opened a channel to the Zephyrian fleet. This is Captain Morrison. We accept your terms. We surrender our ships and place ourselves under your authority. A wise choice, came the alien reply. Prepare to be boarded. Any resistance will result in the destruction of your remaining vessels. As Zephyrian ships moved toward them, Jake looked at his crew one last time as free humans. Remember this day, he told them. Remember what they took from us. And remember that we are still human, no matter what they do to us next. 5 years had passed since the day Jake Morrison watched the Darwin explode in the cold darkness of space. Now he stood in the deuterium mines of Xerion Prime, his hands covered in the blue dust that seemed to get into everything. The pickaxe in his hands was crude and heavy, designed more to break human spirits than to efficiently extract the valuable gas crystals the Zephyrians needed for their ships. Around him, other humans worked in silence. Tony Rodriguez, who had been the New Horizons chief engineer, now spent his days breaking rocks alongside farmers and teachers and children who had grown up in these tunnels. Helen Foster, once a botanist who dreamed of growing earth plants on alien soil, now carried buckets of ore to the processing stations. The Zephyrians had been clever in how they broke apart the human colony. Families were separated and sent to different worlds. Friends were scattered across the empire. Anyone who showed leadership was either killed or sent to the worst work details. The aliens wanted to make sure humans could never organize or plan. Together, Jake's back ached as he swung the pickaxe again. 18 hours of work followed by 6 hours of sleep had been his life for 5 years. The food was just enough to keep them alive and working. The water tasted like metal and made many people sick. The gray uniforms they wore were thin and provided little warmth in the cold mine tunnels. But the Zephyrians had made one mistake in their calculations about human nature. They thought suffering would make people give up hope. Instead, it had done the opposite. Every day that passed, every cruelty they endured, only made the humans more determined to survive and remember who they were. At night, in the cramped sleeping quarters, Jake would whisper stories about Earth to the younger workers. He told them about blue skies and green forests and oceans that stretched to the horizon. He described cities full of lights and mountains covered in snow and beaches where families would vacation during the summer months. Helen had started a secret school, using the few books they had managed to hide from the Zephyrians. She taught the children who had been born in the camps about human history and science and literature. She showed them how to write their names in English and told them about the heroes who had fought for freedom throughout human history. Tony used his engineering knowledge to help improve their living conditions in small ways. He figured out how to fix the broken heaters and make the water taste less awful. He also began studying Zephyrian technology whenever he could get close to their equipment. He memorized every detail of how their machines worked, storing the information for a day when it might be useful. The Zephyrian guards were tall and thin with pale skin that looked almost transparent. They wore black uniforms and carried energy weapons that could kill a human instantly. Most of them treated the human workers like animals, barely acknowledging their existence except to give orders or punish mistakes. But Jake had noticed something interesting about their captors. The Zephyrians seemed to have no concept of hope or defiance. Their society was based on absolute obedience to authority. They could not understand how humans could continue to care about each other despite their circumstances. One evening, Jake was returning from his work shift when he saw a Zephyrian guard pushing around old Pete Williams. Pete was in his 70s and moved slowly, but he still tried to do his share of the work. The guard was angry because Pete had not filled his quota of ore buckets for the day. "Useless human," the guard said in his mechanical voice. "Perhaps you need motivation to work harder." The guard raised his weapon toward Pete, but Jake stepped between them. "He's sick," Jake said. "I'll make up the difference in his quota tomorrow." The guard stared at Jake with those large black eyes. You would sacrifice your rest time for this weak creature? This makes no sense. It makes perfect sense, Jake replied. We take care of each other. That's what humans do. The guard looked confused but lowered his weapon and walked away. Pete gripped Jake's arm with shaking hands. Thank you, son, he whispered. That night, Jake lay on his thin mattress thinking about the guard's reaction. The Zephyrians truly did not understand human nature. They saw caring for others as a weakness instead of a strength. They thought breaking human bodies would break human spirits, but they were wrong. In the darkness of the sleeping quarters, he could hear Helen quietly singing an old song from Earth to comfort a crying child. Across the room, Tony was sharing his food ration with a sick worker who needed the extra nutrition. These small acts of kindness happened every day, and the Zephyrians never noticed them. Jake smiled for the first time in months. The aliens thought they had conquered humanity, but they had only captured human bodies. The human spirit remained free, and it was growing stronger every day. They shared food when someone was hungry. They cared for the sick and elderly. They told stories and sang songs and made sure the children knew they were loved. The Zephyrians could take away their ships and their homes and their freedom. They could make them work in mines and factories and treat them like slaves, but they could not take away what made them human. And someday, Jake promised himself, that would be their downfall. The execution platform stood in the center of the main courtyard, where all the human workers had been forced to gather. Jake Morrison stood with the crowd, his hands clenched into fists as he watched 12-year-old Danny Williams being dragged toward the raised platform by two Zephyrian guards. Danny was small for his age, made even smaller by 5 years of poor food and hard labor. His crime was simple and terrible. He had been caught drawing a picture of Earth on the wall of his sleeping quarters using a piece of charcoal. The drawing showed a blue planet with white clouds and green continents, just like the stories the adults told about their lost home. Supreme. Overseer Kexaval stood on the platform, his tall gray form casting a long shadow. His voice carried across the silent crowd as he spoke. This human child has committed the crime of remembering the inferior world from which you came. He has refused to accept that his life belongs to the Zephyrian Empire. This is the punishment for such defiance. Jake felt his heart breaking as he looked at Danny's face. The boy was trying to be brave, but tears ran down his cheeks. Danny's parents had died in the mines 2 years ago, and the other humans had taken care of him since then. He was bright and curious, and still asked questions about what Earth had been like. Helen Foster stood beside Jake, her face pale with horror. They can't do this, she whispered. He's just a child. He was only drawing a picture. But Jake knew the Zephyrians could and would do exactly what they threatened. They had killed humans before for smaller offenses. They wanted to show everyone what happened to those who refused to forget their past and accept their new reality as slaves. The energy weapon hummed as Kexval raised it toward Danny. The boy looked out at the crowd of humans watching him and, somehow, found the courage to speak. I remember Earth, he said in a clear voice that carried across the courtyard. I remember the blue sky and the green grass and all the stories you told me. I remember. The weapon fired with a bright flash of light. Danny Williams fell to the platform and did not move again. The silence that followed was complete and terrible. Even the Zephyrian guards seemed uncomfortable as they looked at the small body lying on the metal platform. Jake felt something change inside him in that moment. For 5 years, he had focused on survival and keeping hope alive among the human workers. He had told himself that someday they might find a way to escape or be rescued. He had believed that patience and endurance were the keys to surviving until better times came. But watching Danny die for the crime of remembering home, Jake realized that survival was no longer enough. The boy had died for drawing a picture of the world where humans belonged, He had died for refusing to let his captors erase his identity and his memories. If that was a crime worth dying for, then it was also a crime worth fighting for. As the crowd was dismissed and the humans returned to their work assignments, Jake began to think about something he had not seriously considered before. Resistance. Not just the small acts of kindness and defiance that kept their spirits alive, but real organized resistance aimed at fighting back against their oppressors. That night in the sleeping quarters, Jake moved quietly from bunk to bunk. He whispered to Tony Rodriguez and Helen Foster and the other humans he trusted most. "We need to talk," he said. "Not here, but somewhere safe." 3 days later, Jake led a small group through the maintenance tunnels that ran beneath the mining complex. Tony had discovered these passages while doing repair work and realized they were not monitored by Zephyrian security systems. In a small chamber deep underground, Jake gathered with 5 other humans. "Danny Williams died because he remembered Earth," Jake said. "How many more children are going to die because they refuse to forget who they are? How many more of us are going to watch our people killed for the crime of being human?" Helen nodded, her eyes bright with tears. "They killed him to break our spirits, to make us give up hope and accept that we'll never be free." "Then we'll show them they were wrong," Tony said. "We'll show them that killing a child only makes us more determined to fight back." Jake looked around the circle of faces. These were good people who had endured years of suffering and still refused to give up their humanity. "I'm not talking about small acts of defiance anymore. I'm talking about real resistance, about fighting back with everything we have." "We don't have weapons," said Maria Santos, who had been a nurse on the colony ships. "We don't have ships, or communication equipment, or any way to coordinate with humans on other worlds." "We have something better," Jake replied. "We have the one thing the Zephyrians don't understand and can't predict. We have each other. We have our willingness to sacrifice for our people and our refusal to accept defeat." Tony leaned forward, his engineer's mind already working on the problem. "I've been studying their technology for years. Their energy systems have weaknesses. Their security protocols assume absolute obedience. We might not have their advanced weapons, but we have human creativity and determination." Over the following weeks, the group grew. Jake and his core organizers carefully recruited other humans who had shown courage and leadership. They used the maintenance tunnels for secret meetings and developed a communication network based on work assignments and meal rotations. The resistance began with small sabotage operations. Tools would mysteriously break at critical moments. Computer systems would malfunction for no apparent reason. Guards would find their equipment damaged or missing. Nothing that could be traced back to specific individuals, but enough to slow down mining operations and frustrate the Zephyrian overseers. But Jake knew these minor acts of sabotage were just the beginning. Danny Williams had died for remembering Earth, and his death had lit a fire in the human workers that would not be easily extinguished. The boy's sacrifice would not be forgotten, and it would not be in vain. The Zephyrians had tried to break human spirit by killing a child who drew pictures of home. Instead, they had created something far more dangerous than they could imagine. They had created a resistance movement led by people who had nothing left to lose and everything to fight for. The uprising began at exactly midnight, coordinated across 12 worlds throughout Zephyrian space. Jake Morrison crouched in the darkness outside the main power station on Zarion Prime, watching as Tony Rodriguez connected the last wire to their improvised electromagnetic pulse device. Around them, 24 human fighters waited for the signal to attack. The past 6 months had transformed the mining camp from a place of despair into a hidden military base. Using the maintenance tunnels, the resistance had smuggled weapons made from mining equipment and stolen Zephyrian technology. Helen Foster had trained fighters in combat tactics while continuing her work as a teacher. Maria Santos had set up hidden medical stations to treat wounded rebels. But the real breakthrough had come from an unexpected source. 3 weeks ago, Ryan Burke had arrived at Zerion Prime after escaping from maximum security detention on Vega 7th. He brought with him intelligence about Zephyrian military operations and news that human resistance cells were forming throughout the Empire. "The aliens are panicking," Ryan had told Jake during their first secret meeting. "They never expected organized resistance from any species, let alone humans. They're pulling troops from border systems to crush rebellion on the core worlds." Now, those rebellions were beginning in earnest. At exactly midnight, Tony's device sent an electromagnetic pulse through the power station's main systems. The lights went out across the entire mining complex, leaving the Zephyrian guards confused and blind in the darkness. Jake led his team through the chaos toward the command center, where Overseer Kexaval coordinated mining operations. Their boots made no sound on the metal corridors as they moved through the facility using night vision equipment Tony had built from salvaged parts. The command center's doors were protected by electronic locks that no longer functioned without power. Ryan kicked them open and the human fighters poured inside. Kexaval stood behind his control console, his pale gray face showing surprise and fear as he reached for his weapon. "This facility is now under human control," Jake announced. "Order your guards to surrender their weapons and you won't be harmed." Kexaval's large black eyes stared at Jake with something that might have been confusion. "This is impossible. Humans are inferior beings. You cannot resist Zephyrian authority." "Watch us," Jake replied. The battle for Zerion Prime lasted 18 hours. Zephyrian reinforcements arrived from orbit, but the humans had prepared for that possibility. Tony had sabotaged the landing platforms, and Helen's fighters used the mine tunnels to launch surprise attacks against alien troops. Every human in the camp joined the fight, from elderly workers who could barely walk to teenagers who had never known freedom. The cost was terrible. By the time the last Zephyrian position fell, nearly half the human fighters were dead or wounded. Maria Santos worked frantically in her makeshift hospital, trying to save lives with limited medical supplies. Jake walked through the tunnels where bodies lay scattered, both human and alien, and wondered if the price of freedom was worth paying. But across the galaxy, similar battles were taking place. On Centauri Station, human slaves had seized control of the main spaceport. On Tau Ceti Prime, resistance fighters had captured 3 Zephyrian warships. The Empire that had seemed unshakable was suddenly fighting fires on dozens of worlds. The success brought new challenges. With Zerion Prime under human control, Jake found himself responsible for thousands of liberated prisoners who looked to him for leadership. They needed food and medical care and plans for what to do next. The Zephyrians would certainly send larger military forces to retake the planet. "We can't hold this place forever," Ryan warned during a strategy meeting in the former command center. "Intelligence reports show a full battle fleet moving toward this system. They'll be here in 6 days. Jake studied the tactical displays showing Zephyrian fleet movements. The aliens were responding with massive force to crush the rebellions. For every world the humans liberated, the Empire was prepared to sacrifice 10 ships and 1,000 soldiers to take it back. "Then we don't try to hold it," Jake decided. "We take what we can and move on. Hit them hard and fast, then disappear before they can respond." Helen looked up from her own reports. "We've been in contact with resistance cells on 8 other worlds. They're all reporting the same thing. Initial success followed by overwhelming retaliation. The Zephyrians are willing to destroy entire planets rather than lose control." Tony had been quietly working at a computer terminal, analyzing data from captured Zephyrian systems. "I found something interesting," he said. "Their military communications are all routed through a central command station in the Vega system. If we could capture or destroy that facility, we could disrupt their ability to coordinate fleet movements." Jake felt a spark of hope. Throughout the galaxy, humans were fighting and dying for freedom. Some battles were being won, others lost. But the resistance was growing stronger and more organized with each passing day. The Zephyrians had underestimated human determination once again. That evening, Jake stood in the main courtyard where Danny Williams had been executed 6 months earlier. The execution platform was still there, but now it was covered with flowers that Helen's students had made from scrap metal and colored wire. It had become a memorial to all the humans who had died in captivity. Around him, liberated prisoners were preparing for evacuation. They would scatter across the galaxy, some joining other resistance cells, others searching for safe worlds where they could rebuild human communities. The mining camp that had been their prison was about to become a battleground. A young girl approached Jake as he stood looking at the memorial. She was maybe 10 years old and had been born in the camps. "Captain Morrison," she said, "are we really free now?" Jake knelt down to her level. "We're fighting to be free," he told her, "and we'll keep fighting until every human in the galaxy can live without fear." The girl nodded seriously. Danny would have liked that. He always said humans were supposed to be free. As Jake watched, the evacuation ships lifting off into the night sky, he thought about the boy who had died for drawing a picture of Earth. Danny Williams had been right. Humans were supposed to be free, and now, finally, they were fighting to make that dream a reality. Supreme Commander Vextai stood before the High Council of the Zephyrian Empire, his usually composed demeanor cracking under the weight of military disasters that seemed impossible to explain. The Great Chamber was filled with representatives from dozens of alien species, all of whom had served the Empire faithfully for centuries. "The human infestation has spread beyond acceptable parameters," Vextai reported. 17 core worlds have experienced major uprisings. Our military forces are stretched across too many fronts. Some subject species are beginning to question our authority. High Counselor Zexmoth leaned forward from his elevated throne. "You promised that humans were a minor problem that would be easily contained. Instead, they have become a threat to Imperial stability." "The humans fight with irrational determination," Vextai replied. "They sacrifice their lives for abstract concepts like freedom and dignity. They refuse to surrender even when facing certain death. Our tactical computers cannot predict their behavior patterns." What Vextai did not say was that the Empire was facing its first serious crisis in over 1,000 years. Species that had been conquered generations ago were remembering what rebellion looked like. The Corvan Trade Federation had secretly stopped shipping weapons to Imperial forces. The Nexari had begun hiding their industrial output rather than meeting quotas. Jake Morrison knew none of this as he prepared for the most desperate mission of his life. Intelligence gathered from captured Zephyrian facilities had revealed the location of their central command nexus on Zephyr Prime, the alien homeworld. The massive space station controlled communications and fleet movements for the entire Empire. The plan was simple and probably suicidal. A mixed fleet of captured Zephyrian ships and human-built fighters would attack the heart of the Empire. While Jake led the assault on the command station, Ryan Burke would take a ground team to the planet's surface and try to disable the backup systems. "We're outnumbered 50-1, Tony Rodriguez said as he ran final checks on their lead ships' weapon systems. "Their home defense fleet includes battleships that could destroy our entire force with a single salvo." Jake looked out at the ragtag fleet assembled around them. 30 ships of various sizes and conditions, crewed by humans who had learned to fly alien technology through trial and error. Many of the pilots were former miners and farmers who had never seen combat before the uprising began. "Numbers don't tell the whole story," Jake replied. "They still don't understand what they're fighting against." The journey to Zephyr Prime took 8 days through hyperspace lanes that should have been heavily guarded. But the Empire's forces were spread thin, dealing with rebellions throughout their territory. The human fleet encountered only 2 patrol ships, both of which were quickly destroyed or captured. As they approached the Zephyrian home system, Jake gathered his ship commanders for a final briefing. The faces on his communication screen showed the determination and fear of people who knew they were probably going to die. This isn't about military victory, Jake told them. It's about showing the galaxy that humans can't be broken. Every species under Zephyrian rule is watching to see if we have the courage to strike at the heart of their oppression. Helen Foster commanded one of the smaller ships with a crew of former students who had become skilled fighters. What happens if we succeed? What happens if we actually take out their command center? Then we prove that no empire is unbeatable, Jake answered. We show every enslaved species in the galaxy that freedom is possible if you're willing to fight for it. The battle began as soon as they dropped out of hyperspace near Zephyr Prime. The alien home defense fleet was massive and well-armed, but they had positioned themselves to defend against conventional military attacks. They were not prepared for human tactics that prioritize sacrifice over survival. Jake's ship led a direct assault on the command station while smaller vessels conducted kamikaze runs against the capital ships. Human pilots rammed their fighters into Zephyrian battleships, trading their lives for critical damage to much larger vessels. The aliens had never encountered an enemy willing to die with such determination. Tony managed to penetrate the command station's shields with an electromagnetic pulse that disrupted their defensive systems. Jake led a boarding party through the breach, fighting hand-to-hand combat in corridors filled with smoke and sparks from damaged equipment. The Zephyrian defenders fought with technological superiority, but lacked the desperate courage that drove the human attackers. Jake's team advanced through the station deck by deck, leaving behind the bodies of friends and enemies alike. On the planet's surface, Ryan Burke's ground team had landed near the backup command facility. They faced elite Zephyrian guards and automated defense systems, but the aliens had never dealt with humans who treated impossible odds as merely another obstacle to overcome. Kate Thompson, a former Marine sergeant who had survived 5 years, in labor camps, led the final assault on the facility's central core. She fought her way through 3 levels of security, ignoring wounds that would have stopped most fighters, driven by memories of every human who had died in captivity. When Kate finally reached the command chamber where the backup systems were located, she found herself face-to-face with Supreme Commander Vextai himself. The alien leader was tall and imposing, armed with the finest weapons the Empire could provide. "You cannot defeat me, human," Vextai said. "I am genetically engineered. For combat superiority, you are an inferior species." Kate smiled, blood running down her face from multiple wounds. "Maybe I am inferior, but I'm fighting for something you'll never understand." The battle between Kate and Vextai was brief and brutal. The alien commander had superior strength and reflexes, but Kate fought with the fury of someone who had nothing left to lose. When Vextai fell, his death sent shockwaves through the entire Zephyrian military command structure. Above them, Jake's team had reached the main command center. Tony worked frantically to plant explosive charges while Jake held off the remaining defenders. The station shook as more human ships crashed into its superstructure, each impact bringing them closer to total victory or total annihilation. As the charges detonated and the command station began to break apart, Jake looked out through the shattered windows at the planet below. Zephyr Prime burned as rebellion spread across its surface. The empire that had seemed eternal was crumbling in the space of a few hours. 5 years after the fall of Zephyr Prime, Jake Morrison stood on the observation deck of the New Geneva, watching construction crews put the finishing touches on humanity's first interstellar embassy. The building floated in space at the edge of neutral territory, a symbol of the new galactic order that had emerged from the ashes of the Zephyrian Empire. The Empire had collapsed faster than anyone had predicted. Within weeks of losing their central command structure, subject species throughout Zephyrian space had risen in rebellion. The Corvan Trade Federation declared independence and offered military support to other resistance movements. The Nexari Industrial Collective stopped producing weapons for Imperial forces and began manufacturing supplies for liberation armies instead. What surprised Jake most was how quickly former enemies had become allies. Zephyrian civilians, freed from their rigid military hierarchy, proved to be peaceful people who had been as oppressed by their own government as the species they had conquered. Many Zephyrian soldiers laid down their weapons and asked for asylum, rather than continue fighting for a cause they no longer believed in. "The Andromedan delegation has arrived," announced Alex Rivera as he joined Jake at the observation window. Alex had been promoted from colony ship pilot to captain of the new Geneva, humanity's flagship vessel. The ship's crew included humans and aliens working together as equals, something that would have been unthinkable during the dark years of Imperial rule. Jake nodded and straightened his diplomatic uniform. He still found it strange to be addressed as Ambassador Morrison instead of captain, but the role had been thrust upon him by circumstances. After leading the rebellion, he had become the unofficial representative of humanity in the complex negotiations that were reshaping galactic politics. The embassy's main conference room was filled with representatives from dozens of species, all working together to establish the framework for a democratic federation. The Corvan delegate was a tall, insect-like being with multiple arms that moved gracefully as she spoke. The Nexari representative was a crystalline entity that communicated through light patterns. Even former Zephyrian worlds had sent observers to the proceedings. "The question before us today," said the Corvan delegate, "is how to ensure that no single species can ever again dominate the galaxy through military force." Jake listened to the discussion with mixed feelings. These were important conversations about building a better future, but he knew that the real work of healing would take generations. Billions of beings had suffered under Imperial rule, and the scars left by centuries of oppression would not disappear overnight. During a break in the negotiations, Jake walked through the embassy's memorial hall. The walls were covered with names of those who had died fighting for freedom from every species that had participated in the rebellion. Danny Williams's name was there, along with Lisa Chen and Kate Thompson and thousands of others who had paid the ultimate price for liberty. Small group of children was visiting the memorial with their teacher, a middle-aged woman who had once been a Zephyrian prison guard. She had defected during the final months of the war and now dedicated her life to educating young people about the importance of protecting freedom and dignity for all beings. "Why did the humans never give up?" asked a young Nexari child, her crystalline body flickering with curious light patterns. The teacher considered the question carefully. "Because they understood something that the Empire never did. They knew that breaking someone's body doesn't break their spirit unless they choose to let it. The humans chose to remain human no matter what was done to them." Jake smiled at the simple wisdom in her words. It was true that humanity had special qualities that made them difficult to defeat, but those qualities were not unique to their species. Every being in the galaxy had the capacity for courage and determination and hope. The Empire had fallen because its victims had chosen to remember their worth as individuals. That evening, Jake attended a reception for the diplomatic delegations. He found himself talking with Dr. Samuel Carter, a former colony ship physician who now ran medical relief programs for war-torn worlds. Samuel's work had saved countless lives and helped former enemies learn to trust each other again. "I sometimes wonder what would have happened if the Zephyrians had never found us," Samuel said as they watched aliens and humans dancing together to music that blended styles from a dozen different worlds. "Someone else would have tried to conquer us eventually," Jake replied. "But I think we proved something important. We showed that freedom isn't something that can be given or taken away by others. It's something that exists inside each person, and it can only be destroyed if they choose to surrender it." Later that night, Jake stood alone in his quarters looking out at the stars. Tomorrow he would return to Earth for the first time since leaving on the colony mission 15 years ago. The planet had been liberated 2 years earlier, and reconstruction efforts were well underway. Cities that had been destroyed were being rebuilt, and the oceans and forests were slowly recovering from the environmental damage caused by Zephyrian industrial operations. But Jake knew that the most important rebuilding was happening in the hearts and minds of the survivors. Children who had grown up in slavery were learning what it meant to make their own choices. Adults who had forgotten how to dream were remembering their hopes and ambitions. Families that had been separated for years were finally being reunited. A soft chime indicated an incoming message. The holographic display showed the face of Helen Foster, who was now serving as Earth's Minister of Education. She looked tired, but happy as she spoke from her office in the rebuilt city of New York. "I wanted you to see something," Helen said. "We just finished the new curriculum for primary schools, and I thought you'd like to know what we're teaching the children about. Recent history." The display changed to show a classroom where a young teacher was reading to a group of 6-year-olds. The book was titled "The Day We Chose Not to Break," and it told the story of ordinary people who had refused to give up their humanity even in the darkest circumstances. "We're making sure they understand that freedom isn't free," Helen continued, "but we're also teaching them that every person has the strength to protect their own dignity and the dignity of others. The children need to know that they can choose to be unbreakable no matter what challenges they face." Jake felt tears in his eyes as he watched the children listening to the story. They would grow up in a galaxy where slavery was illegal and war crimes were prosecuted by international courts. They would have opportunities that previous generations could never have imagined. But most importantly, they would know the truth about human nature and the power of the human spirit. The teacher finished reading and asked the children what they had learned from the story. A little girl raised her hand and said, "People tried to break us, but they found out we can't be broken because we choose not to break." Jake smiled and closed the communication channel. Tomorrow he would go home to Earth and help with the continuing work of rebuilding. But tonight, he was content to know that humanity's greatest victory was not the defeat of an empire, but the preservation of what made them human in the first place.